In the 1870s, there was a job on the American frontier that paid more per season than a schoolteacher made in 3 years. Men lined up for it. Outfits hired fast and asked few questions, and somewhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 2 of the men who took it did not make it back to collect their second paycheck. That job was nitroglycerin hauler, and if you have never heard of it, that is exactly why we are here today. By the late 1860s, the mining boom across the territories had hit a wall, literally. Hard rock mining in Nevada, Colorado, and California meant drilling into granite and quartz formations that would break a man's back and a company's budget using black powder alone. The industry needed something stronger, something that could shatter deep rock faces in a single shot. That need created a market, and that market created one of the most dangerous occupations in the history of the American West. Nitroglycerin had been invented by Italian chemist Ascanio Sobrero in 1847, and from the first moment he tested it, he was terrified of what he had made. It was roughly 13 times more powerful than black powder by weight. It could be absorbed through the skin. It gave you blinding headaches just from handling it. And unlike black powder, it did not need a spark to detonate. Friction, heat, a sharp jolt, even a change in temperature could set it off. Sobrero reportedly said he wished he had never discovered it. Alfred Nobel eventually stabilized nitroglycerin into dynamite in 1867 by mixing it with diatomaceous earth, and that product reached American minds fairly quickly. But here is the thing the history books gloss over. Dynamite was expensive to ship from the East, and freight costs across the territories were brutal. So dozens of mining outfits in Nevada, Colorado, and California made a different call. They bought raw liquid nitroglycerin, which was cheaper, and they hired men to haul it overland in wagons and on muleback from the nearest rail depot to the mine site. The pay reflected the risk in a way that was almost insultingly honest. A standard frontier laborer in the 1870s might earn $1 to $1.50 per day. A skilled muleteer hauling ordinary freight might clear $2. A nitroglycerin hauler could command $5 to $8 per day, sometimes more on difficult mountain routes. That was life-changing money on the frontier. Men with families, men with debts, men who wanted to stake a claim of their own. They looked at those wages, and they made a calculation that did not always account for the full cost. The actual hauling process was as crude as you would imagine. Liquid nitroglycerin was typically transported in tin canisters, packed inside wooden boxes, sometimes cushioned with sawdust, sometimes not. The canisters were loaded onto freight wagons or strapped to pack mules. The hauler then drove or led the outfit across whatever terrain stood between the depot and the mine, which in places like the Sierra Nevada or the Colorado Rockies meant switchback mountain roads, creek crossings, loose shale slopes, and temperatures that swung 50 degrees between dawn and midday. Temperature was one of the hauler's quietest enemies. Nitroglycerin freezes at around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, and frozen nitroglycerin is even more sensitive to shock than the liquid form. A canister that had partially frozen overnight and then began to thaw as the sun hit the wagon bed was sitting at its most unstable state. Haulers working mountain routes in spring and fall were dealing with this condition regularly, often without fully understanding the chemistry behind why their cargo seemed to sweat and shift on cold mornings. There were incidents that became legend in the territories, not because they were rare, but because they were so complete. In 1866, before widespread Western use, a Wells Fargo shipment of nitroglycerin exploded at their San Francisco office, killing several people and leveling part of the building. Wells Fargo immediately banned nitroglycerin from their freight operations entirely. That ban did not stop the trade. It just pushed it into the hands of smaller, less regulated outfits willing to take the liability, which meant the men doing the hauling had even less institutional protection than before. The men who did this work were not reckless by nature. Many of them were methodical, experienced freighters who treated the cargo with the kind of focused respect you develop when you understand the consequences. They learned to check their canisters for leaks before loading. They avoided hard stops on downhill grades. They chose the smoothest available line through rocky terrain, even if it added miles to the route. Some veterans wrapped their canisters in wet burlap to regulate temperature. These were not written rules handed down by any outfit. They were survival habits passed mouth to ear between men who had seen what happened when someone got it wrong. One of the most documented hazards was something the haulers called seeping, when nitroglycerin slowly leaked through a cracked canister and pooled in the bottom of the wooden crate or soaked into the sawdust packing. A hauler who reached into a box to check on a canister and disturbed that saturated sawdust the wrong way was in immediate danger. There are accounts from Nevada mining districts of men simply disappearing on a route, with only a scorched wagon frame and a scatter of splintered wood found by the next outfit that came through the same trail. The mules and horses used in this work deserve a mention because they were as much a part of the equation as the hauler himself. Experienced freighters preferred older, calmer animals for nitro runs. Mules especially, because mules are less prone to panic than horses, and less likely to bolt or stumble unpredictably. A young horse that shied at a rattlesnake on a switchback could end an entire outfit in a fraction of a second. Some haulers reportedly paid premium prices for what they called steady mules, animals with a proven record of composure on rough terrain, because a calm animal was as valuable as any other piece of safety equipment they had. The boomtowns built around hard rock mining had a particular relationship with the nitro haulers. These men were essential. Without them, the mines slowed or stopped. But they were also treated with a kind of nervous deference that fell short of actual respect. Saloon owners in Virginia City and Central City were known to let nitro haulers drink on credit, not out of generosity, but because nobody wanted to argue with a man who had spent the day handling liquid explosives and might still have traces of it on his hands and clothes. They called it professional courtesy. You would have called it self-preservation. The physical toll on the haulers who survived long enough to accumulate it was significant even without a catastrophic incident. Chronic nitroglycerin exposure causes what workers came to call powder headaches, a brutal vasodilating effect on blood vessels that produces migraines, so severe men described them as feeling like a railroad spike behind the eyes. Prolonged exposure was linked to cardiovascular effects that were not understood at the time, but were observed in the pattern of haulers who aged badly and fast. The ones who died slowly from the work just did it over more years than the ones who died quickly. By the late 1870s and into the 1880s, dynamite became cheaper and more accessible as American manufacturing scaled up, and the demand for raw nitroglycerin hauling began to decline in the major mining districts. But it did not disappear overnight. Remote claims in the territories, smaller operations without the capital to stockpile dynamite, and outfits in regions with poor rail access continued to rely on liquid nitro runs well into the 1880s. The job faded out gradually, not because anyone decided it was too dangerous, but because the economics finally shifted enough to make the safer option the cheaper one too. Nobody put that in the history books, and I think you know why. The story of Western expansion was told by the people who benefited from it, the mine owners, the railroad men, the politicians who named the boomtowns after themselves. The men who hauled the nitroglycerin that made those mines profitable were hired, used, and in too many cases consumed by the work. They left behind almost no written record, because most of them were not writing men. What survives are incident reports, payroll ledgers, and the occasional letter home that made it before the route did not. When you look at the full picture of what nitroglycerin hauling actually was, the pay, the exposure, the terrain, the complete absence of regulation or recourse, it sits in a category that the frontier produced with disturbing regularity. Jobs where the market decided a man's life was worth exactly as much as it cost to replace him. The West was not won, it was just outlasted by whoever could take the punishment. The haulers took more punishment than most, and the ones who survived long enough to spend those $5 days were the exception, not the rule. If you have made it this far, you already understand why this channel exists. These were real people making impossible choices inside an economy that had no safety net and no memory for the men it burned through. The nitroglycerin haulers are one chapter in a much longer story of frontier labor that history mostly skipped because it was inconvenient to the myth. We are not going to skip it here. If this kind of history is what you come here for, subscribe and stay close, because there are more of these stories, and every single one of them deserves to be told straight.